So thanks, folks. As I said, really the reason I'm here, well, two reasons. One is because Eric and I are friends, and it's all about the networks, right? And the other is that, I've started this with my wife, this thing called Embrace Race. And it's as was described, we spent a lot of time pulling together spaces, mostly online, but we'll be doing it increasingly in the real world. Spaces for people to think about race, race in their own experience, in their own childhoods, race in their experience as parents, how they deal with it, how they don't deal with it usually, and what it could mean. So we have, a Facebook page and a newsletter that comes out every twice a month and so on. And then we're getting into more and more programming. Part of the reason I say all of that is because I am definitely not an expert, right? I'm not an expert, especially in child development. So you're experts in child development. I have done a lot of work around race, and I'm a parent. So I'm needy. I need things as a parent. How do we do this work, right? So we have two brown-skinned girls. How do we do this work? We already have lots of experiences that I could share. There was mention of Catherine, I think, was the one who mentioned I'll be sharing personal and professional expertise. I'm actually not going to share that much personal stuff just because there's a lot to get through. But I did want to share a couple of things, or maybe one thing in particular, that really begins to speak to the investment that I have in this issue and how I think it shows up. And I hope that, as you hopefully continue to do this work yourselves for the centers that you're part of, that you too will find opportunity to share some of your personal experience. I also wanted to mention that, here's the overview. There will be, well, let me quickly go through the overview, right? So development, it's pretty straightforward. Development of racial bias among young children, where I'm summarizing some research that I've read, right? Again, I'm not a researcher in this area, and I'm not an expert, but I think there are some pretty pronounced themes of what the research has found that's relevant that you should know about. Yeah? You just look kind of, you're focused. Yeah, okay. So development of racial bias among young children, I'll share that quickly. Some Q&A, we'll stay here together in case you have some questions, and hopefully I can answer, or we can answer them collectively. Then what are the roots of racial bias? Here, really looking at the roots of racial bias in children, right? Another thing that would be really relevant for you is your own racial bias and the racial bias that you may bring into classrooms with respect to kids, even the little kids that you deal with, right? Which we don't like to think that we might in fact be harboring biases against some of the kids, but in fact it is probably the case, at least in some contexts, but that's a different issue, right? And again, this is there's enough ground to cover just on the first bit, so I won't be touching on that here, but we'll do a Q&A, we'll have some breakout discussion, and then of course, what can we do? And we'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, so here's me. All right, this is a little personal bit. It's like, why is he doing a picture of himself? Because I'm doing this little personal bit. This is my little personal bit, right? And part of the reason I'm sharing, there are so many personal bits I could share with you. The reason I'm going to share this one is because this is actually a relatively recent revelation for me, what I'm about to share. And it's maybe a non-obvious one. So what's the relevance of doing this work with kids and race and racial attitudes? What does it have to do with? Well, I think it has a lot to do with a lot. I'm going to give you this little story to offer one indication. And I've actually never shared this story with certainly folks in this setting. But this is a picture of me when I was about 28, I think. And my wife, Melissa, I'll also be sipping water quite a bit. My wife, Melissa, posted this on Facebook around one of our anniversaries. So I think it was our 20th year of being together. on our 20th year being together anniversary, which is more significant for us than wedding anniversary. And what's sort of funny about it is, so, it was easy for me to take this off, and I wanted to refer to this, sort of when I was in my 20s. Sort of funny because I look kind of ticked off, right? I think I'm ticked off here. I think I'm ticked off with her. So it's sort of funny that she would post that on our anniversary. But she loves me anyway, so this is pretty great. So here's the thing that I noticed fairly recently, or that sort of started coming together with me only fairly recently, which is when I've seen photos of myself from my 20s, right? So about a year ago, I got together with someone I dated in my 20s, right? Who's a friend, and she was showing me some pictures of us in grad school, which is where we met. And I had the same reaction that I had to this, which is, wow, I was kind of good looking, right? I know, that's a totally weird thing to say to people you just met, but I'm being real with you, okay? So I thought, but here's the thing, I was totally surprised, right? So each time I've seen a photo of myself as a younger adult, and even back to, if I look at a yearbook photo of myself, as a senior in high school, I'm surprised to conclude that I was, right, a reasonably attractive person. Why am I surprised? Because at the time I didn't think so at all. That never occurred to me, right, that I was an attractive person in general, much less a physically attractive person in particular. Why was that? So this is the thinking I've been doing, because I went to a high school that was almost all white, right, in New Haven, Connecticut, which is where Yale is, and a lot of Yale professors sent their kids to my high school. So there are a lot of wealthy, or certainly well-to-do white kids. It was a small school, and this is definitely not a sob story, right? So having, it's sort of an elite day school, and it served me well in some ways, right? There are lots of privileges associated with being at this school. So it's not a sob story. But what did happen is, in retrospect, is that, I think of Ken Goldsmith, right? Isn't it weird? Like, I can't remember people I just met, but I remember Ken Goldsmith, whom I haven't seen in 30 years, right? So Ken Goldsmith, I remember having a conversation with Ken Goldsmith. There may have been one or two other kids around. He was a white kid. We were juniors at the time, I think. And Ken Goldsmith said, I can see a black girl, he was white, I can see a black girl and recognize that she is attractive, that she's pretty, but I cannot be attracted to her, right? I cannot be right? There's no sense of attraction to her. And I remember at the time thinking, okay, so that feels wrong. That feels weird and wrong, right? To say that there's a whole group of people, racially defined, that you cannot be attracted to. But now, again, in retrospect, I realize that I felt exactly that way, right, in high school. And it's not even about being attractive per se, right, being more or less attractive. It's about what I think of now as sort of registering, right? Do you register on the radar of your peers? Right? So when you're 15, 16, 14, 13, right, hormones are flying all over the place. And it's actually, I think, quite important to one's sense of personhood, right, to feel that you register on the radar, right, that you might be considered. I have a good friend who is biracial, black parent, white parent. She's early 40s, super attractive person in general. And I was telling her this sort of reflection, and that's why I'm surprised when I see photos of myself, because I did not, right, my self-conception was not as someone who might be attractive to people. And she said that, she's American, and she said that when she went to London recently, she actually had that feeling, right? Just if casual interactions with people, it's not that people are hitting on her aggressively, but she actually felt, oh, this is what it feels like to register with people. So when the few people I went out with, who I know thought I was attractive, my thought at the time was, okay, so there are, out of every 100 women, right? There are going to be 5 who find me attractive, and I'm really lucky to have found 3 of them whom I like, right? So, wow, I'm really lucky. That's really, right, including my now wife. So that's interesting, right? And that has, I think, everything to do with race, racial attitudes, racial sensibilities, in a way that may not, right, there's no reason that would be obvious, that that could be part of what's at stake when we think about racial attitudes in children. Are you wondering why I told you that story? Or do you get why I told you that story? Okay, some nods. All right. So what I want to do is start by talking about, again, development of racial bias in young children, and I'll go fairly quickly. First, I want to start with just a few studies, just to give you a sense, if you don't know, of how the kinds of ways in which they try to understand how kids, very young kids, are thinking about race. So first, here's a study with over 100 black kids, over 100 white kids, from 6 months of age, and they tracked them over time until they were 6. And they, as part of it, they asked them, here's some photos of kids, who would you like to play with? And they looked at their answers and mapped their answers against the ages they were when they answered those questions, right? So how does preference change over time? So at the bottom, you see when there were 30 months, and this is share of kids preferring same race. So what we know is that there is a natural inclination to have in-groups and out-groups, right? So if you have a white child with a white mom, say, it's actually quite natural for the kid to have a preference for white skin in the context of skin color, because that's what she's familiar with. Right? And she's not making a value judgment about dark skin, it's just what she's familiar with and comfortable with. So that makes sense. If a white child had a black or Latino or Asian caretaker, she would develop a preference for that as well, right? So what we find is that at 30 months, essentially 2/3 of black and white kids prefer the same race playmate. What's sort of interesting is, what about the 1/3 that don't? But 2/3 do. By 36 months, for the black kids, it shifts dramatically. So at 36 months, these are the same kids. 30%, or roughly 1/3 of the black kids, prefer other black kids, right? Say, I want to play with someone who looks like me, but 2/3 prefer white playmates. Whereas for the white kids at 36 months, an even greater share still prefer white playmates. And then by 60 months, 5 years old, you see essentially black kids still on overall prefer white kids, and white kids also prefer white kids, right? So something happens. If you take this seriously, something has happened in that stretch between 30 to 36 months or so. And this actually is a fairly consistent finding. Yeah?
So then is it they have a preference towards their same race, or they don't have a preference?
They do at 30 months, and then the black kids don't 6 months later, right? Overall,
So
obviously there's a mix.
They could choose either black or white.
No, at 36 months, a third of the black kids, right? So that's the blue bar, right? A third of the black kids at 36 months prefer black playmates, and 2/3 prefer white playmates. Whereas here, right, the vast majority preferred black playmates. So across all 3, white kids prefer white playmates, right, typically, but black kids only prefer black playmates at the earliest age, right? So something has shifted, and the question is what? Let me go on to another one. Right, black, white, Asian kids, ages 3 to 12, shown faces that are in some cases ambiguous racially, but also sometimes a little bit of ambivalent of ambiguity about what the expression is on the face. And the question is, they ask the kids, where does the expression become angry? And what you find is that among the white 3 and 4-year-old kids, angry faces were more likely to be characterized as black than happy faces were, right? So if you have this racially ambiguous face, and you have this expression, and the kid says, "Oh, that's an angry expression," then is that an angry expression of a black person? Right? Is it black people who are more likely to be seen as angry by the kids? Or is it a white face that's more likely to be seen as angry? Put differently, imagine the same expression on a black face and a white face. The kids are more likely to see the black face as expressing anger than the white face, right? Another one is empathy of children bounded by race. So they have 5, 7, and 10-year-old white kids. They give them all kinds of scenarios. They say, imagine you stub your toe, a ball hits you in the head, you bang your knee on the corner of a bed, right? They give them 12 or 14 different scenarios that might cause pain, and they ask, here's a black kid, here's a white kid, and there's another kid who we don't know what his race is. How much does it hurt? Right? So if this kid stubs his toe, how much does it hurt? Does it hurt not a lot? Does it hurt a little bit? Hurts a lot, hurts the most. Here's what you find. At 5 years old, the kids say that the black and white target will hurt the same, right? So if a black kid and a white kid both stub their toes, how much does it hurt? About the same, right? This is actually averaged over all the 12 different scenarios. It's not one thing, it's 12 different things, right? But the question is one of empathy. Right? If Erica, punches the wall right now, right, and I imagine how much does that hurt her, is there a difference in how much I think it hurts her depending on her racial identity and mine? That's what we're really getting at. And this is actually a very interesting question in the context of adults. Lots of work has been done on this, for example, around juries and sentencing, right? Because the idea is, if it's true that predominantly white juries, for example, think that they need to punish a black offender more than a white offender for that offender to feel the same amount of pain, then they will. And that actually is a finding, right? So in other words, if I think that black people are so tough that I need to throw them in jail or in prison for 5 years, right, for them to be punished enough, but I think I only need to throw a white person, or for that matter, a wealthy person, 2 years for them to feel the same sort of distress, for them to be punished the same amount, that obviously has implications for sentencing, right? And we think that's true, so the question was, is this also true of kids? And what we find is that at 5 years old, the 5-year-old kids essentially say black and white kids feel the same amount of pain, but by the time you get to 7, the black kids apparently feel less. The white kids think that the black kids feel less pain, right, for any given thing. And at 10 years, the discrepancy is even greater. So this is how much pain the 10-year-olds say the black kids will feel, but the white kids feel this much pain. That's a fair bit more, right? So again, we need to think more about what the implications of that are, but they can be profound. And finally, maybe you've seen this one, this ambiguous situation. You had 6 and 7-year-olds on one hand, 13 and 14-year-olds on the other. The 6 and 7-year-olds were shown this. And the question is, what's happened here, right? So you have 2 kids, one black, let's say, one white, a swing, and what just happened, right? Is it that one kid pushed the other kid off the swing? Is it that one kid fell off the swing and another came over to help? Maybe the third kid is just watching, or maybe that second kid who's standing there is just watching, right? So we're asking the kids to interpret this scenario and seeing how they interpret it and whether or not it makes a difference, the race of the 2 kids and the child's own race. So these are the questions. What's happening in the picture? Is it good, bad, or neutral? Second, can the 2 children in the picture be friends? And then would the parents of the children in the picture like it if they were friends? This is what we find. So what I've done is you have here, right? So the share of the kids who said these are young white kids, so these are the 6 and 7-year-olds. And that share, 70%, interpreted negatively. So they said something like, well, one kid pushed the other kid, right? 10% interpreted it positively. So maybe, right, it's the kid who's coming over to help his or her friend is what I'm seeing. And then neutral, which again, maybe that's, they're not coming over to help, they're just watching, they're not doing anything. They didn't push, but they're not helping either. And what I've done here is come up with this little summary measure, which is just subtracting the share that's positive from the share that's negative. And if the negative is bigger, I'm saying that's a negative, right? So 70% negative and 10% positive is a minus 60. You see what I'm saying? And then doing the same, just so we can more easily compare what's happening across these. So what you see, again, the young kids, either the 6 and 7-year-olds, the young white kids up here, the young black kids down here, and by this just subtracting, the positive from the negative, what you see and what you can see, what's obvious is that the white kids were much more negative, right? They were much more likely to be negative in their interpretation of what they're seeing in that ambiguous scene. Oh, and then finally, or not finally, can the kids be friends? We do the same thing. The young black kids are much more likely to say, yeah, those kids can be friends, right? Partly, presumably, it's because they interpret the thing more positively in the first place, right? Yes, they can be friends, 59 to 41% positive, say yes versus no, and the young white kids are much more negative. They're much more likely to say no, they can't be friends. And what would your parents approve? Here, they had data on whether or not the kids at school interacted with other race kids a lot or not. Right? So with the kids who did not have contact, right, where the kids did not have contact across race, they were likely to say, no, their parents would not approve. Whereas the white kids who did have lots of contact across race were much more likely to say, yes, their parents would approve. Yeah? Does that make sense? So here's a little summary, right? This is my daughter Lola when she was 1. And I said, Lola, this is what's going on. Babies discriminate, right? And that's the look she gave me. It's unbelievable, right? I said, hang on, I'm not done. When I say discriminate, I don't mean the way people usually mean discriminate. I just mean they make distinctions, right? So 3-month-old babies show significant preference for same-race faces. Newborns show none, right? So baby arrives and baby's ready to go with whatever. Baby's ready to love whoever's loving baby, right? At 3 months old, now baby probably has 1 or 2, a small number of caregivers, and baby's going to be drawn to that, right? So they're making distinctions, they're discriminating in a technical sense, but not with any big value-laden thing attached to that. So do they discriminate? Yes. Do they harbor racial prejudice, meaning this value judgment about race, racial attributes? No. But then around 2 to 5, right? 2.5, 3, 3.5, it depends. These studies vary in any number of ways. So it's, you can't, and then kids, of course, vary, so you can't say exactly, but roughly in this 2 to 5 range, something does happen. So many studies show that 3 to 5-year-olds express bias based on race, and that usually by the time kids are entering kindergarten, there are racial biases. By 6 or 7, racial bias has become internalized in many cases, right? So, I looked at one study that in turn looked at over 100 studies of race, looking at race, racial attitudes in kids. And this first bullet is from that. Explicit prejudice, meaning the prejudice that kids can express, they will tell you, right? That increases from early childhood around 2 to 4 till middle, about 5 to 7 years of age, decreases slightly from middle to late childhood, right? So the expressed biases that kids have follow that pattern. It peaks around 7, and then it comes down a little bit. Now, it comes down a little bit, presumably because kids are starting to understand that it's not cool to have these biases, right? They're just learning what's socially acceptable, and so they're less likely to tell you at 10. When we look at implicit bias, on the other hand, right, which is you can think of as either the hidden bias, you've heard the term, right, implicit bias. All right, so this hidden bias, this bias that we're either not aware that we have, or even if we're aware, we're much less likely to express it, right? We may not even acknowledge it to ourselves. That doesn't go down. That's what the second one is about, right? So 6-year-olds, 10-year-olds, and adults all have about the same amount of implicit bias. So I wanted to stop there just a moment and ask if you had any questions about that. And you can all hear me, and I'm hopefully making some kind of sense. Yeah? Okay. So now, what are the roots of racial bias, right? So I want to talk about 3 different sorts of things. So so for those kids, those majority of kids for whom for whom race has content, right? Race has a value judgment associated with it. Where does that come from? And it's what you've heard, I think. It comes from all over the place, right? So this is my little representation of family and extended family, right? School, of course, books. Who recognizes this? Who is it? Who is it? Tintin. I got into this big flap in Amherst around Tintin. So Tintin, right? Who lives in the neighborhood? What's this? Frozen. Everyone who has like a 5-year-old knows Frozen, right? Toys, news and popular culture, peer group, and there are other things we could name, right? It comes from all of it. One of my favorite pictures, probably my favorite picture of Obama, right? You've seen this one, right? Little black boy says, really? Your hair is like mine? I want to feel your hair, Obama bent over somebody. I love that photo, right? Love that photo. And here's my take on, I want to talk about racial representation, which is, by which I mean literally, who shows up in what environment and how. Here are my 3. The question is, right, all those previous environments, the neighborhood, the schools, the books, all of that, who shows up and how? The premise is, if we're not able to encounter others, right, in different contexts, it doesn't even have to be an immediate encounter, although that's helpful, right, in person, face to face. I can play with you, I can talk to you, and so on. But maybe if it's not that, it's through books or it's through movies. I'm sure you've heard, right, the thing about mirrors, right, mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. You've heard that? Right, so the idea of, right, books as both reflections of me, right? So I want to find some books where I can find myself, or they can be windows into another world, someone else's identity, or sliding glass doors where I can maybe actually enter this other world in some way. The question is, who's showing up in these environments? And why does it matter for these 3 things? Because I think if we see ourselves, we know that we matter. All right, this is my own little formulation that's not so elegant, but something like that. Right? If we see ourselves, we know we matter. Or if we can see others, we can get to know them. Right? They become knowable. If we can see them, I call that connection. And if we can see it, we can do it or be it. Right? This is inspiration. Right? This is where sort of the idea of role modeling may come in. So let's talk about neighborhoods first. Right? That was one of the arenas. And here I'm talking about literally who do you see in your neighborhood. Right? Now, seeing somebody in your neighborhood doesn't get us, we're not falling in love because I see you in my neighborhood, but it's at least a precondition for getting some work done together. Right? So this is Birmingham, Alabama, and what you're looking at is a map. This actually is a map of every individual in Birmingham, Alabama, according to the census, I think the 2010 census. So and they're color-coded. So Erica's from Alabama. She's looking closely at this. She's like, I need my glasses on this one. Yeah, so blue are white people, and green are black people. Right? What are you seeing? Come on, people. What are you seeing? That is intense, right? That is intense. So not to say that there aren't some pockets, right? So here are some white people, but they're really clustered, right? Here's some white people up here, and here apparently are some black people over there, and certainly here and there, right? You see some green and mostly blue areas, and there are going to be some blues and mostly green areas. But if everyone was perfectly integrated, what would this map look like in terms of color? It'd be one color, right? One uniform color. Now, we don't expect that. We want to say that we've fallen short if it's not one uniform color, but this is dramatic, right? These are two different geographies that are almost completely racially coded. So what I'm suggesting is that the possibility for these people to get to know each other is pretty limited. Chicago, right? You get the idea. Again, it's not that there aren't different colored dots in some places, but when it stands out that clearly, right? So if you know Chicago, you know what the neighborhoods are, right? This is where white people live, or upper class white people, and this is where black people and middle class black people live over here, and Latino, etc. Detroit, right? So this is 8 Mile Road. White people live up here, black people live up here, except for what's happening there? Right? A little cluster of black people right there, another one right there, another one right there. Again, it's not just white and black people. There's some other colors mixed in here, and But wow, that's intense. That's an intense amount of segregation. LA, Milwaukee, New York, Philadelphia. I saw on the Penn State website that 75% of undergraduates at Penn State come from the state, come from Pennsylvania. Philly is by far the largest metro area in the state. So, I have no idea, of course, but, some non-trivial portion of your kids, of undergraduates at Penn State across the campuses, come from the Philly, 15%, 10%, I don't know what it is, but some non-trivial share. And in all likelihood, right, they come from a quite segregated residence, neighborhood, and what's true of the school if it's true of the neighborhood? Come on, people. It's really segregated, right? The people in the neighborhood supply the kids who go to the schools, certainly if it's public school. Yep.
What about Latino populations and other populations? Just white, black?
No, all of these colors represent different populations. Right, so I just haven't, because actually I'm not remembering what stands for what, but the point I really want to make is just about segregation. So I'm not worrying about which one of these represents which groups, except in the black-white case, because it was essentially black-white in Birmingham and in Detroit. But no, all of these, right, so red is one thing, orange is one thing, green, blue, and so on. But I think, again, there are distinct neighborhoods that are racially coded. That's really the point, yeah? And there's San Francisco. So there's this idea, I think, that our democracy, right, that for our democracy to thrive, and I'll talk more about this in the presentation later this evening, for our democracy to thrive, it's important not simply that we represent ourselves, right? That we vote, we are civically engaged so that we can express our preferences on whatever. It's also really important that we try to have that we, as Barack Obama put it in his 2004 speech, right, at the Democratic National Convention, which is really the one that launched his national career, he said, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper, right? It's really important, he feels, and I think there's a strong strain of that through talk about US democracy, that we care for each other and about each other. Right? And yet here, I'm showing you that there's a dramatic differences, cross-racial differences in how people understand the problems in their community, right? So there may be two things that are happening here. So to give you, to just look at one example, that first column, right, what that says is that 17% of white non-Hispanics say that mistreatment of people by police is a problem in their community. 47% of Hispanics say that, and 64% of black people say that. Right, so at the extremes, what's the math? 47% more black people than white people say mistreatment of people by police is a problem in their communities. Right, that tells us two things. One, they may well live in different communities, right, which we've seen is true in many, many places. Members of different racial groups live in different communities, so yes, what's a problem in one community may not be the problem in another community. And the other thing it suggests is that even when they live in the same communities, they have very different perceptions of what's going on. Wanted to drive home the point about schools in the Philly area. So these are 3 different years, right? 1989 to 90, 99 to 2000, and 2010 to 2011. And it tells us how many black students went to schools that were composed in a certain way racially. Right, so what this says is that in the most recent year, in 2010 to 2011, 65.4%, right, 2/3 of black students that year went to schools that were 90 to 100% minority. Right, where most of that, the minority we're talking about is mostly black and Latino. Right? So 2/3 of black kids went to schools that had 90% plus black or Latino students. 38% of black students went to schools that had 99+% minority, right? So there were no white kids in those schools. 2 in 5 black kids went to schools where there were no white kids. Here, Latinos, right? 45.6%, right? Almost half of all Latinos went to schools that were very heavy minority schools. 13.5% went to schools that were essentially all minority schools. Again, right, we're just speaking to what is the opportunity for kids to interact with each other in the place where they spend a lot of time, right? We know most are not doing it at home, right? Most homes are not integrated. School is where we may look to do that, and for a huge proportion of kids, it's not happening. This is Erica's work, Erica Frankenberg, right? She did the only study I'm aware of that looks at preschool segregation. So in 2013 and 14, 41% of the preschool population she looked at were white, 19% were black, 30% were Latino, 4% Asian, so that's the vast majority of kids. And what you see that half of all black and Latino preschoolers attended segregated minority schools. It's actually fairly similar to what we just saw, right? So again, these are black preschool students, and you see half of them attended preschools that were 90 to 100% non-white students. And slightly more than half of Latino or Hispanic students attended schools that were 90 to 100% non-white students. And finally, wanted to get to this issue of social segregation, because I think this is what it comes down to, right? Part of what's important about physical segregation, spatial segregation, as in neighborhoods, as in schools, is that, again, we're not giving kids the opportunity to interact with each other and get to know each other, right? That we know, I think it's fair to say, we know that that's one of the best ways to stave off stereotyping, to stave off bias. The American Values Survey, right, has on a couple of occasions asked people, okay, I want you to think about, the last 6 months and the people with whom you've had a meaningful conversation, right? A conversation that was important to you. You sat down, let's say one-on-one and one-on-two, small group conversation about something that was meaningful. So these are your social intimates, right? These are the people you're close to. And some people named, right, one person, some people said, gosh, in the last 6 months, I can't think of anyone I had that conversation with, a meaningful conversation with, which is sad. But some people named 1, 2, all the way up to 7. And then they looked at these, right? And they asked people to identify. How do those people identify racially? So what this says is that for white Americans, when they looked at all the people listed as social intimates, 91% of those people were white. Okay, so it's also true that for 75% of the white respondents to this survey, everybody was white, right? So 75% of white adults, if we're to believe the survey, and why not, have no non-white intimates defined in this way, defined as someone you spoke to about a meaningful topic in the last 6 months. For Black Americans, 83% of them, 83% of their collective network was Black, 8% were white, and for Hispanic Americans, roughly 2/3 were Hispanic, 19% were white. Again, to me, that speaks to a high degree of segregation, right? Socially, who are we dealing with? Who are we confiding with? Whom could we have these conversations with around race, for example? Right, so all the way through, I'm looking at, right, we're thinking about representation. Who shows up in these spaces that are important? For kids, books is really important, right? Books are really important. So diversity in children's books, 2015, right? Someone actually did a count, and this is what they found. Well, 73.3%, right? Essentially 3 in 4 children's books featured white characters. 12.5% featured animals and trucks and other, right? The lead characters were not human. And then the rest, 7.6% African American and so on, right? So what we're saying is that characters of color were represented about as often as animals and trucks in children's books in 2015. Whereas white kids were substantially overrepresented, at least relative to kids of color, right? So are kids of color seeing, are children's books mirrors for kids of color? Not as a whole. Are they windows for white kids into non-white spaces? Not as a whole. Why are the 4 books on this page unusual? Does anyone know any of these books? What's unusual about these? Can you think of what that might be? I'll tell you. Does anyone know? Yes, please.
There's a black child and a white child.
Yes. In particular, she said there's a black child and a white child, right? And in particular, these are all books that represent cross-racial friendships. Right? And apparently, these are exceedingly rare. So a research team, was trying to do some work using children's books featuring cross-racial friendships as a prompt for the work they wanted to do, and they actually had to create their own because they had such a hard time finding enough books that featured cross-racial friendships. Again, it's what's showing up. That's the question, right? That's the point in all of this. What's showing up for kids, right? And for adults, for that matter. But what's showing up? If your child or if our children read books about cross-racial friendships, it becomes much more possible, right? Now they can see it. They can aspire to it. Oh, that's a good thing. They're more open to it than they would be otherwise, but apparently there are very few of them. So this is a video maybe some of you have seen. It's not about race, but it's such a powerful example of the importance of representation and of kids being able to see themselves that I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so little girl is getting a gift.
Okay, down here.
Read the letter first. Read the letter first. What letter?
There's a letter in there.
You don't love it.
Open it up and read it. What's it say?
Emma's doll.
Dear Emma's.
What?
You
You gotta be kidding me. No!
Show it to us.
It's got a leg like me!
Oh. Do you love her?
I
Oh. So you gotta finish reading the letter. So, Mommy and Daddy had it sent off to this company, a Step Fed Prosthetics, and so they said after she arrived, she was given a room to stay while her new leg was being made. She was fitted with a leg in her favorite color pink and started walking on it right away. After a few weeks of training to walk and run in her new prosthetic, she is ready to go home and live her life without limitations with you. Oh, okay.
What do you say to the people?
Tell him.
Thank you!
Tell him thank you.
Thank you for making it all like me!
Oh.
Right? I mean, if anyone tells you that representation doesn't matter, you need to show this video. So, wanted to ask if you have any questions here, and then wanted to break up the group into some breakout sessions and do a little bit of work. So, first, any questions about what's been said so far?
I heard a while ago about efforts to do like busing of children from areas into schools where they, so that they're mixing the white and black students at different schools.
Mm-hmm.
Busing them out of their neighborhoods to go to school. Do you know anything about that and any research and about that kind of stuff?
Attempts, so busing kids out of school.
They were busing the kids from their neighborhoods to schools in different neighborhoods so that they were mixing the students more. I don't know if they went through with any of that. I don't know what cities this was in. But,
Of course, there's a long history of busing, right? Erica, do you want to say anything about that? About busing. So she's heard that there are plans to possibly bus kids out of neighborhoods to integrate schools. And there's a, you're talking about what level?
I don't remember what level. It was a long time ago that I was hearing about it. But I was curious if you knew anything about that or if there's any research looking at how that's helped or not helped or what.
Any research on whether and how that's helped or not helped?
Sure, and I'm happy to speak more. I think that's actually what a lot of my research focuses on, about the benefits for students who attend schools like that. I'm so happy to look into research.
Any other questions or thoughts about what's been said? I wonder, do you believe it? Do you believe it? Sadly, yes. Is there anyone who's skeptical and would be brave enough to say so?
I would say that I know that I have, some internal biases that I probably have, whatever, put in the can or whatever. But I would say that I also think that younger the children are, it is amazing how, like when you talk about them preferring different playmates of different races, I feel like I would think that I'm amazed how much they play with each other no matter what. Now, I didn't point it, I don't necessarily, I've never done a study or asked them or anything like that, but my gut feeling is that I felt like they were more not judgmental than what the studies seem to show.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we get it from somewhere, so you're learning that. How and when and why, that's the big mystery.
So one thing to note, right, is that so fair number of research studies that looking at kids and racial attitudes, and they're doing it across a wide range of circumstances, right, including a wide range of behaviors, right. So when a child's response to an ambiguous photo, right, where it's not clear what's happening and he or she has to interpret that, the answer to that question, to how the child thinks about that scenario and what it means, may well be quite different than, right, the one around picking a playmate from a group of photos. One thing we do know is that kids are more likely to stick with their in-group as they get older, right? So you've probably heard of that book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? Right, so one interesting question you could ask is, well, if that's true, it's probably also true that, let's say, the white kids are also sitting together in the cafeteria, but we tend to look at, right, the smaller cluster of students. But it is true that, a group of 11-year-olds, or 14-year-olds is more likely to be sticking together in the cafeteria than a group of 5-year-olds on the playground. Right, and part of what's interesting is, why does that happen? There are a couple people back here. Yep.
I was just going to say that, and this is just my opinion, that the area that we live in here in State College, and that I live in, it is a very diverse community, and I think that the families that we provide care for is also very diverse. And, a lot of our kiddos grow up from infants all the way through till they leave us as a 5 or 6-year-old. So they see that diversity every day. But in saying that, I can still, when I think of play groups, I still oftentimes will see, Asian children grouping together. Is it because of the similarities in their families? Is it because they hang out outside of school, so their families know each other? Is it the language that pulls them together? I don't know. So even as diverse as it is, and given the fact that they grow up in such a diverse community, I still see some of that, and I definitely, I sat here shaking my head to, a lot of the things that you were saying. We see it, and we see it in the news. It's true. It's and unfortunately, I think we live in a bubble here. We live in this bubble of diversity, and we don't see, I think, a lot of that's happening, and it's,
20 minutes, you're outside the bubble.
yeah, yeah,
It's the university little bubble. That 20
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, but exactly. That's why I said, I can speak, I live in town, I live right in State College. But I also I did grow up 20 minutes outside of State College, and it was very different.
Mm-hmm.
My personal experience growing up was very different from the last 20 years of my life living in this community.
Mm-hmm.
I just said to a friend of mine the other day that I don't know if I appreciated the community that I currently live in as much, I'm going to be a little political, before Donald Trump became president, as I do now, because I realize that I'm living in a community of a lot of people who think very similar to myself,
Mm-hmm.
very liberal. And if I didn't, I don't know what I would do. I'd have a really difficult time. I'd have a really, really hard time having those ideas and those thoughts if I were surrounded by a lot of people who were not as liberal. It would be hard.
So I wanted to get to you in just a moment. Just one thought about, because I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, and Amherst is also a place where lots of folks refer to the bubble, right? The bubble. In fact, I've lived in a lot of bubbles, right? It seems. And on one hand, that's there's something real about that, and there's a sameness to the kinds of places I've gravitated toward because of the work they do and so on. And it's also true that the bubble is also not nearly as much of a bubble as we think, I think, right? So as Amherst is a place that I am, that my wife and I are really getting into, we're getting into the life of the community, we're getting involved in some of the issues, and in a way that we haven't before in most other places we've lived. And we find that when you start scratching the surface, there definitely is less of a bubble. So one implication is that I think there really is always work to be done, right? So we, after Trump was elected, I was invited to probably 4 different living room meetings, right? And it probably happened here too, of people, pulling their hair out and thinking, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Many of them were new to activism. And that term, the bubble, was used a lot, right? So with the implication being there isn't any work to be done in here in Amherst, so, can we weigh in on something that's happening in Louisiana, right? Which was literally one example. And actually there's a lot going on in Amherst, right? There's a ton going on in Amherst. The very issues that people are talking about looking to Louisiana or Texas or New Hampshire to do are also playing out in Amherst, and people just didn't know it. Please.
My hand was up because of the busing issue. I don't know much about it, but I don't think it was about race, but about equality in education. Where you are provided with good school, where you are in your neighborhood. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert, but I think it was necessary. And if you post on people, then it's a picture, it's not real. So if I can't drag people to my friend's house after school, then the friendship ends in school.
Yeah, about busing, I'll just say this. Oh, sorry. So she was saying that for her, her understanding that the busing had more to do with the resources, right? Resources than with demography, right? Than with people, than with racial integration necessarily. And is that right? So, and I would say, the issue of whether or not really what I'm talking about, right, which really is about racial integration and people getting to know each other, and that being an important context for attitudes, the formation of racial attitudes, is I think probably the most controversial piece of, let's say, busing, right? I think the less controversial piece is, it is true, since education is largely funded locally, and since Black and Latino families have much higher poverty rates, as do Native American families, for example, as compared to white and Asian American families, if you have segregated Latino and Black communities, their schools are likely to be tremendously underfunded, right? And it's not just about money, it's about the quality of the teachers and the credentials they have, and the books and the facilities and all of these things, so that the way to, as it were, even out the allocation of educational resources is to mix the kids, right? So I think that's the logic that is easiest to articulate in a lot of these arguments, as opposed to, because then, right, the danger is a lot of people bristle if it sounds like you're saying for Black kids to get a good education, they need to sit next to white kids, right? As opposed to they need to have the resources they need to do the work they need to do. But the basic point is, right, what are the roots of racial bias? And I'm not trying to give an exhaustive treatment of that, of course, but I want to point to 3 things, right? So the racial representation and social segregation is what we looked at before, and the basic argument is we don't see each other, right? We're not living, we don't live in integrated neighborhoods or anything close to it, by and large. I mean, obviously there are exceptions and there are variations, but many of us live in quite segregated neighborhoods, go to quite segregated schools. Our social networks are segregated, largely. The books that our kids read, all of those things, right? So that means that our kids aren't seeing examples of integration. They aren't seeing examples of cross-racial friendships. They're not seeing people in their neighborhoods who don't look like them very much. And we should note, as I'm sure you all know, even in ostensibly integrated schools, very often there's tremendous segregation within that, right? Like the kids, you might have a school that is, looks wonderful on paper in terms of mix, but the social dynamics within the school are very, very separate. So now I'm going to talk about racial bias in adults, and the point is, right, in adults as role models and caregivers. So if we, to the extent that we have biases that are activated by all sorts of things that we carry around with us, you can bet it's going to affect the way we socialize our kids, even when we mean well. And that is the big insight, really, of implicit bias, right? Hidden bias. This idea that we may not even know, right? There is a difference. It's fine for me to say, and it's a good thing for me to say, I want to be egalitarian. I want to teach my daughters, right, to be open-minded and not make value judgments on the basis of people's skin color or gender or sexual orientation or any number of other things. But if I harbor that myself, it's going to be hard for that not to be expressed in some way. There's something I can do. I can monitor. I can be mindful. I think of years ago, I was working on my dissertation. I was in DC, and I was at I want to say George Washington University's library, just doing some work. And I'm spacing out, as I often do. And I'm spacing out. I'm sitting at this table, and I'm just thinking idly, and I see this young man, probably an undergraduate student, Asian American, and I thought, I wonder where he's from, right? It's like, I wonder where he's from. If I'd seen a white kid or a black kid, I would not have wondered where he was from, right? And this, of course, is one of the big burdens that Asian Americans carry, that people are always wondering where they're from, right? So you say, oh, I was born in Oakland. Okay, but really, where are you from, right? I mean, before that, where are you from, right? Your English is so good. A lot of, right? I think almost any Asian American adult will tell you that they've had that question asked of where they're from. So I'm like, oh, so now I need to monitor that. I need to monitor that, right? So let me start going through. Oh, and then the colorblind socialization, especially since we'll probably skip it. The idea is kids are being socialized with respect to race. They're being socialized. It doesn't matter whether you're trying to or not, they are being socialized. The question is, are you also going to be proactive in your socialization, proactive and explicit? Unfortunately, too many of us, often for the right reasons, right? You think, oh, if you don't mention race, then our kid will never be infected by race. That's a mistake. And in responding, in adopting sort of a colorblind stance, we're doing them a disservice, right? So I think of that as a cause, a source of racial bias, the development of racial bias in children, because so many of their caretakers, right, stay away from race, often because of our own discomfort with the race, right? But let me go through the racial bias in adults piece, because I think that is pretty compelling. So there is online Project Implicit, which Harvard runs. You can go to a website. In fact, I encourage you to do that. You can go to a website and take implicit bias tests yourself and get results. There are implicit bias tests around all sorts of things. This isn't the only way they do implicit bias testing, but it's the most common way. And they have results on all sorts of things. So race is the one that has gotten the most attention, but there are lots of other things. So this one is about abled, what they call abled people compared to disabled people, right? And they have a way of testing for whether you're inclined to, you have a preference for abled people versus disabled people. They have them for, people who are very overweight versus people who are slim, for young people versus old people, right? In this country, we don't like old people very much, right? Obviously, that's a broad generalization in this as in, but I think culturally it's very true, right? There are lots of other places in the world where we have much more respect, veneration, right? Want to be with old people in a way that's true of young people here and not so much of old people. So in this case, what this is showing you is that if you add up, the number, so you had, over 2 million people taking this test over many, many years and taking all sorts of different tests, and then they aggregate across all these findings, right? And the question is, if I take a test and it turns out that I I have more positive associations with what they call abled people versus disabled people, then I would go into one of the upper three categories, right? Depending on if my preference is a very strong one, a moderate one, or a slight one. And if you add those those percentages of people who have a preference of some kind for abled people, that's what, 76%. Right? So 76% of all the people who have taken that particular test showed a preference for abled people versus 9% who showed a preference for disabled people. So let's look at some race ones. This is white people versus black people. 70%, right, of the people who've taken this test, and that's all people, right, all people. So it's also possible to break it out. Well, what did white people, right, how did white people's preferences register? How did black people? How did other people? But for all people, that is 70% had a preference for white over black, and 12% had a preference for black over white, with the rest in the middle. Here, for white Americans versus Asian Americans, and the association with foreign, which is just what we were talking about, right? That was I clearly had this bias, maybe I still do, right? Assuming clearly implicitly that this Asian American young man must have been a foreigner, must have been not American. This is another 70%, right? 70% of the people, if you add up those first three numbers, have a preference for what they're calling Euro-Americans, or Euro-American, right? They associate white people with American and Asian American people as foreigners, right? 70% of us do that. 17% of us do the other way. Arabs, Muslims versus other people, 60% have a preference for other people compared to Arabs and Muslims. I'm actually a little confused by this. I'm not sure what Arab Muslims means. In this case, I should have looked this one up more carefully. Most of this data is probably drawn from, I'm guessing, 2005, the next 5-10 years. My guess is that the bias against Arabs and Muslims is much stronger now because of what we've seen. And then the question is, right, so these are tests of implicit bias as opposed to explicit bias, biases that we're aware of, that we can articulate. And the question is, what difference does that make? If I have a bias that I don't know about, what difference does it make? It makes, it turns out, a lot of difference. So here are just 4 areas. There are many, many areas where researchers have looked at the association, the linkage between what's going on in your head, the implicit biases in your head, and what you do, what it means in the real world, right? The behavioral consequences of that. So top left there, right, medical doctors, right, or medical care professionals and how they treat patients. So we know, for example, that the higher the implicit bias of a medical care provider, the more, the less aggressive he or she is to be in treating patients of color, right, or black patients, for example, right, where a more aggressive treatment is generally what you want. Here, this is just a neighborhood. There's a great study. We showed half the participants in the study video of a residential neighborhood, right? Let's say this neighborhood, with the only difference being it was a video, and you would see people, presumably residents of the neighborhood, getting into cars and picking up their mail and doing things that neighbors do. But to one group, all those people were white, and to the other group, they're all black. And the question they asked those participants was, tell me about the neighborhood, right? What's the crime rate like in the neighborhood? Does that neighborhood have good schools? What are the property values in the neighborhood? Are they going up or going down? And at this point, you won't be surprised to learn that when the people were black, so it was literally the same neighborhood and the same cars, exactly the same thing, and they hired actors to play the residents of the neighborhood, right? And one group black, the other group white. And the people, the subjects of the study, rated the black neighborhood much worse than the white neighborhood, right? So the black neighborhood, they suppose, had a much higher crime rate, right? The schools were worse, property values were lower and going down, that sort of thing. Not hard to imagine what the implications of that are. Here, lower left, right? Lots of research around shooting, right? So if you're a police officer and you have a split second to identify whether that suspect, who's hiding behind something, has a gun or a wallet in his hand, you have a split second, right? That's when implicit bias really works its stuff. You don't have time to sort of think about it and, I want to be fair, and no, you have a split second to reach a judgment about whether or not that person poses a danger. And what we find is that people who are higher in implicit bias are much more likely to mistake, something innocuous for a gun if it's in the hand of a black person, and much more likely, in the case of tests, to mistake a gun in the hand of a white person for something innocuous, right? So the white person is more likely to not get shot when he or she is holding a gun, and the black person is more likely to get shot when he or she is not holding a gun. Does that make sense? And then this particular result was from a very well-known study about employment discrimination, where they set out a whole bunch of resumes that were exactly the same, except in some cases they had an identifiably black name, and in some cases a name that most people would suppose was not that of a black person. And I think they also varied the address shown sometimes, right? So at the top of the resume, you have an address, and yes, if you're in Chicago and there are the distinct neighborhoods and you know the city, then you know that a person with that name and that address is definitely a black person. And the question is, did they get called back? Did they get an interview? Those sorts of things. And it was dramatically, right? Black-sounding names were 50% less likely to be called back. So again, the point is, imagine holding. Right, so these are real-world consequences we're essentially looking at, but imagine that these are also people. We are also people who are socializing children as we hold these biases. And I wanted to show you one more in a little bit more detail. Thomas Meyer, a legal associate. So Thomas Meyer, right, what they said in this study was they gathered together a whole bunch of law partners in law firms, 60 of them in total. And they said, we are doing a study of the writing competencies of young attorneys. And so we have Thomas Meyer, who's a third-year associate at NYU Law School, and he's written a memo. And what we want you to do as people, right, who are expert in, have long been in the legal profession, is to assess this memo, grade it, critique it, and so on, as part of this study. And what they did is half the people were told that Thomas Meyer was black and the other half were told that Thomas Meyer was white. And otherwise, they were given exactly the same memo. So these are the grades they gave. So what you see is that, first, overall, black Thomas Meyer did much worse, right? On a 5-point scale, white Thomas Meyer, on average, got a little bit over 4. Black Thomas Meyer got a little bit over 3. Then on specific things, this one is especially fascinating, right? So there were, in fact, 7 spelling errors in the memo. Again, it's the same memo they're looking at. How many did they catch? Well, in the case of black Thomas Meyer, they caught about 6 on average, 6 of the 7. But with white Thomas Meyer, they caught slightly under 3. Right? These are spelling errors. That's pretty straightforward. So literally being told that someone was black versus white made this difference in how many spelling errors people reported. Similarly, for what's called technical errors, factual errors, right? In every case, White Thomas Meyer does much, much better. They did something of a follow-up study where they spoke to, again, law partners and diversity, sort of legal, diversity professionals in the legal field. And they asked people to give us your observations. So this is very interesting, right? It's a little bit like this group when in that last conversation, right? Many of you, when you reflect for a moment on who your social networks are and where you live and what you've seen and contrast your experience now versus your experience at some earlier time in your life, it's really clear to you, right, that race matters. Race matters in all sorts of ways. What's fascinating to me is how often we hear that race doesn't matter, when actually if we sit down and talk to people, they almost always acknowledge that it does. Right? So in this case, right, here are things that people actually said. People seem to take, so this is, again, a diversity professional at a law firm, probably. And he says, well, people seem to take special notice when Asian Americans are quieter, and that gets commented on, not directly, but subtle references to their drive, their ability to compete comes up. And again, if you're an associate at a law firm, that's a big deal, right? That is a huge deal to be seen, to be sort of this automatic assumption that if you're Asian American, maybe you have less drive. Less than the best grades for white students weren't seen in the same way as they are for minorities, especially if the candidate provided a reason for the grades like illness or family issues. Even when we consider white students' grades are right at or just below the cutoff, we never talked about lowering standards. We just talked about better understanding the whole candidate. Right? Another obviously big deal. Right? So if the cutoff at the low end is whatever it is, GPA, or grades from law school, and in effect, right, you're not saying I'm lowering the standards to let in this white person. I'm giving a context for that. She had a struggle, whatever. But you're not doing the same for other candidates. Obviously a huge problem. We talk about fit with African Americans, especially women. I don't think we fully realize how much we continue to assume that they just won't fit. Again, right, if you've been in a law firm, which I have as a young, naive person, a lot of teamwork. The issue of fit is really important. So if you come in and you already have an X against you because the assumption is you won't fit, that's going to be a problem. And notice, how these things are cumulative, right? The cumulative effect of all these things is going to be dramatic. Minority pipeline programs, we take these candidates, but we talk about them differently because they come to us from minority pipeline programs. Okay, and then I'm actually going to skip the colorblind socialization, but again, the real point there was that it's strong, right? The aversion that a lot of parents, especially white parents, but not exclusively white parents, have to talking about race is dramatic, right? So one of the slides talked about these two books, a study where they asked, a large number of white moms to read these two books that were very much about race, right? Like very evidently about race, to read to their small children and to talk about it, and that 94% of the white moms never talked about race, right? They read the books and they never mentioned race, right? Including one book that had an African-American character, lead character, and they did not mention that he was African-American in reading to their children. There are other studies, right, about how they wanted to work with these parents, white parents. They wanted to do a study on race, but they couldn't do the study because they just refused to talk about it. Right? So they literally had to stop the study because too few parents would actually talk about race, which was the whole point of the study. So again, if we refuse to talk about race with our kids, then we're likely to be leaving the racial content of the messages that they're getting from elsewhere and from us implicitly unchallenged, right? And I think that's clearly a source of the bias that most of our kids have. So now I wanted to talk about some guidelines. What do we do about this? And this is going to be very, right, I really am talking about guidelines because, right, a course of a day or a short amount of time isn't nearly enough for you to really wrap your minds around particulars, right? You're really going to have to talk amongst yourselves and get to that answer, right? Get to those answers. But I think there are some useful guidelines that will be helpful. In a way, the biggest one, and I'm going to just talk about this one a little bit, and then we'll go through, watch one video, and then we're going to break again into breakout groups. This one I want to give the most attention to, the only one I really want to talk about in some detail right here, because in some way I think it's the most important one, right? And I told some folks at lunch about having, Melissa and I were part of a diversity committee at our daughter's preschool at one point. For several years, both daughters went there. And we kept wanting to help initiate sort of a community-wide conversation about race and all the things that we were talking about. We knew lots of people were talking about, in one by one and in whispers, right? And we had a couple people in, and we were completely unhappy with what they had to do and say and how they led things. So then a number of us, 17 of us, 14 parents, 3 teachers got together on a Sunday for a couple hours. And it was amazing. It was an amazing conversation. And two of the 3 teachers were in tears, right, talking about their experience. And one of them, in particular, talked about how at MLK Day, for MLK Day, she really wanted to do something more robust for her students, right, who were second graders. And she was unhappy with, she thought what she had done the previous year was pretty flimsy, what the school did as a whole was pretty flimsy, trivializing the whole thing. And the question is, what does it look like? But there wasn't support at the school, right? This is a self-professed progressive school. And people were, sort of broadly supportive, but she had no support to actually generate that curriculum. Then she did, she worked very hard. She figured some stuff out. She went online. She read some stuff. She came up with something. She presented it. And then she was approached by 2 parents who were completely ticked off that she had done it, right? Because, as we know, there's lots of disagreement about the age at which it's appropriate to start talking to kids about race, right? Whether to talk about race at all, at any age, and certainly how you do it if you're to do it. So we had 2 parents who came and were very upset with some part of that with her. And, so the 14 parents, of course, are very sympathetic with her. And maybe a couple of people are saying, "You go, we have your back." And I thought, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to say we have her back? So if she does something, she teaches a lesson, she has a lesson plan that we think is great and, right, really robust and gets the kids involved, and then there are more angry parents, and we say we have your back, does that save her? Right? Like, what? I actually had no idea, right? It seems to me that what's really important is to make sure that the people who matter have your back, right? If it comes to that, because if you're a teacher and you have 20 kids, you might have 40 parents or whatever, some number of parents who are one of your important constituencies, right? And they will disagree. There's some point at which they disagree with each other about, right, what you should be doing, certainly around a thing like race. And I think what you want is for, if there is that disagreement, or that you can go to your colleagues, but especially your administrators, and say, this is what I did, and it's clearly within the parameters that we agreed on, right? So ideally, most of you in this room, certainly who belong to a given center or whatever the appropriate administrative level is, right? I think, can you reach agreement? And it's not easy because you too will disagree with each other, right? So I'm not saying it's easy, but if you can reach agreement, right, at this sort of unit level, about what the parameters of the work you do around, race and diversity inclusion, what that is, right? With the idea being, okay, this is what it looks like, and within that we have flexibility, right? Because you'll want to do things somewhat differently, and your kids are a somewhat different group of kids from each other, and all of that stuff. But that way, right? And then your bosses and your administrators know what you're doing. That actually strikes me as hugely important. And then the second piece, again, is, it's hard work. It's hard work. I'm going to show you this video in a little bit with Louise Berman Sparks, who is a lauded anti-bias educator for young kids. And the part of the video shows you, she talks about her process, the process by which she got into this and sort of instituted this, her concern and her response to anti-bias work, the need for anti-bias work. So of course you need to talk about it. Kids will be asking questions. I'm sure you've heard some questions that are relevant. And the more you encourage them to do it, the more they're likely to ask some more. And we want that exploration. I was telling folks earlier that I love it when a little kid comes up to me and is curious, right? Typically a little white kid, right? In the supermarket, oh, he's black. That man's dirty, right? It's like, I don't love being called dirty, but it's like, I get it, right? I mean, from the perspective of a 3-year-old white kid who hasn't really dealt with people of color, people with dark skin, right? That's as I also said earlier to folks, I think of a little girl I was told about who said, oh, there's a rule that women can't be president. You get that. It's like, is it coincidence that we've had 45 and no women? It's not coincidence. It's not exactly a rule. It's kind of a rule. It's not exactly a rule, but it's a fair inference, right, for a 5-year-old to say, oh, there must be a rule that women can't be president. That's where we come in. We're like, well, it's not quite that. Here's the deal, right? What is the explanation for why they're no? What's the explanation that a 5-year-old will understand? That's a challenge. But that is the challenge, right? It's not to say, oh, what are you talking about? Let's not talk about that, whether it's with respect to the presidency or with respect to race. It's also fine to say, you know what, I don't actually know that. So at lunch, someone mentioned the example of a hijab, right? Someone wearing in a hijab. And the question, so if your kid says, yeah, why is that woman wearing that thing around her head? And maybe you don't know, right? You don't have in the moment the kind of answer you'd like to be able to have. I think it's okay to say, well, it has to do with her religion, but actually I don't know the details of that. Let's come back to that, or let's look it up together. Let's go online, look it up together. I personally tend to err on the side of being really straightforward, right? And again, the challenge is with really difficult topics, how do I find the language and the level that's appropriate for my child, right? So my almost 9-year-old is definitely a different kid than my 6-year-old. So my answer to any given question might well be somewhat different. But that's the challenge. For me, it's not do I speak to it or not. Give your kids language they can use. Integrate environments where children learn. Integration ideally, or I guess ideally, means in person, right? So this question we often get, and it clearly would apply to everything in this town outside the university, what do you do if it's only white people? Right? What do you do if it's only black people? What do you do if it's only whatever people? There are other ways to get some measure of integration. Right? Again, this is why books are so important. Build a great library. Books are important. Build a great library. Can I say that, one of the interesting things about doing Embrace Race, we are distributing a lot of curated materials, right? So other people's stuff, and we're trying to pick the best. Given our purposes, we're generating some of our own material, not very much, but some of our own. And one thing that's interesting is, at this point, we always know what's going to get a lot of pickup on Facebook. All right, so what do people want? We know, right? So anything about white privilege, lots of pickup on Facebook. Books, lists of books, and that's a fascinating thing, right? because I think there are two things going on. One is, yeah, books are really important. And, you know, a mom of a 4-year-old, almost 4, or a 5 or a 6-year-old, or what, you know, a young child is always, we're always looking for books, right? Good books for our kids. But it's also relatively easy. Right? It's a relatively easy thing to do. Like, I'm going to get a great book, and I've done my work, right? So, don't stop with books, but for sure start with books. They are important, it seems to me. Being mindful of your own biases and behaviors. This presentation will be yours. I'm sure it can be, you know, disseminated to you. I'm certainly leaving it. I'll bill you later. I'm kidding about the billing. I'm not going to bill you later. Right? Test yourself for implicit bias at implicit.harvard.edu. Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. So always you have to put James Baldwin in every presentation you do. So yeah, it's hard. It's not so much fun, but you know, it is maybe an eye-opener if you take a test and, right? If you take a test and you find that you have some bias, and that's likely enough because most people do, don't beat yourself up. It's pretty human, actually, to have bias. But also, right, you want to take some responsibility for it. You want to think about, what do I do with this? And again, you're a role model to the kids in your classroom. And what you say at the end of the day, I think, is not as important as what you do. So, you know, another interesting thing about our Embrace Race experience is people are always, you know, I'm talking to lots of people, and I say, this is what we're doing. And most of the people will say, oh, that sounds great. It's really important because, you know, so many of us need help on how to talk to our kids about race. And I say, yeah, that's, you know, that's a part of it. But it's more than that, more than the talking. Help kids learn about and respect others. Be honest with kids about bias and bigotry. This might be the hardest one in somewhere, one of the harder ones, because I think we even here in this so-called bubble, I'm sure that we have quite different opinions about the role of bias and bigotry in so much of what we see, right? So what do we do? Right? In the extreme case, if you have two parents, right, who have a child together or children together, and they really disagree, right? What about those homes that have, right, one person, often he voted for Trump, and she voted for Hillary Clinton, right? And they have profound disagreements, which is happening in many homes, about what does the result of this election tell us about race in this country and people's attitudes about race? I mean, that fight is happening. So how are they going to get together around how to tell a story about racial inequality in this country, right, along any number of dimensions? Right, and again, that's the critical thing. So the observation that there is racial inequality, that's the easy part. On any number of dimensions, that is true. Right? What's the story we tell about why there's racial inequality? What's the story we tell our kids about why there's racial inequality? What's the role of bias and bigotry in that story? That's tricky stuff. That's why you get paid the big bucks, right? Okay. We're moving on. Help kids find their voices. So for somewhat older kids than you all are dealing with, right, I'm thinking in terms of advocacy, right, agency, the agency of children. We tend to think of children as sort of adults in the making, right? So we're doing work now, we're investing in them now for the adults that they will become. And of course, we are doing that. And they're actually also people now, right? They're real people right now. Real people who can do real things. And I think there is, especially maybe, for children of color, I think there may be no bigger favor we can do them than show them that they can do things right now, right? They're not likely to change the world, right? We're not necessarily talking about that, but they can speak up, they can be heard, they can do work. and some children do. Huge favor, right? Nothing makes you feel better, and I think that's true of adults, right? So you spend, I spend a lot of time railing at a lot of things, but there's nothing like then having, in this case, Embrace Race, right, as a vehicle for trying to do something about it, even at the margins. And I think the same is true for everybody, and certainly for kids. Here, you can do this. You can send a letter to your senator, right? Help your 7-year-old write a letter to your senator to say how he feels, how she feels about it. Plan for a marathon, not a sprint. Maybe one of the hard things we do to ourselves, and it derives from the colorblind mindset that a lot of people have, is this idea that, when we talk about it, right, we talk about it so rarely that there is so much weight on that conversation when we have it. It's got to go right. It went wrong. It's going to be terrible. I've ruined her life. You have to make it routine, right? It's a thing you revisit again and again and again, ideally. In an earlier session with the parents, this idea, we weren't able to really pursue it, but this idea came up of fragility, right? We have this idea that kids are so fragile, right? You say one word out of place and that's it, you ruin their lives. They're going to be on the couch. Melissa and I talk about how, we're going to put our kids on the couch. 20 years from now, Lola's going to be, talking to her therapist about this thing I just said to her, right? And obviously being conscientious and being responsible and trying to do the best we can, right? There are lots of us that wind up on a couch, sometimes because of things our parents did. I don't mean to trivialize it, but kids are really resilient, much more resilient than I think we give them credit for. Again, this is Louise Derman-Sparks.
When I started teaching preschool children, I was really surprised to realize that they were already asking questions about racial identity, about gender identity, that they already were developing attitudes about disabilities and about gender and race, that the biases in our society were affecting them. They were bringing them into school. They were teasing other children. And this was a big surprise to me because nothing in my preparation for teaching had let me know that children this young, that preschool children, were already beginning to form and deal with these issues. When I started teaching college at Pacific Oaks, I had more of a chance to look into what was really going on, and I began to look at literature and discovered that there was a lot more research about how children developed identity than I had been aware of when I was going to school myself. Began to do some of my own research and ultimately also started to look around at what was happening, how teachers in early childhood were dealing with the issue of diversity, and felt that there were a lot of things we weren't doing based on what I was learning about how children develop identity and attitudes. The main thing that I felt I was becoming more and more dissatisfied was the way that multicultural curriculum, which was the main approach for helping children learn about diversity, was falling into the trap of what I call a tourist approach, in that in many programs, multicultural curriculum was done by celebrating holidays and maybe bringing in a few objects of a particular culture into the classroom, asking a parent to come and wear the national dress of their culture. But what I saw was happening, it was like a tourist going to a country for a few days and kind of going and seeing the celebrations and maybe looking at a couple of the dances and then going on to another country and then ultimately going home. And it was kind of like visiting a culture for a day or two and not integrating it into the daily life of the classroom. And what I started to worry was happening is that children in the process of learning about other people's culture were in fact learning stereotypes, because they were not really getting an idea of how people live their daily lives. They were not having different ways of being integrated into the classroom. And the other piece that wasn't happening is that the multicultural curriculum wasn't directly addressing how young children develop negative attitudes or how bias was already affecting young children. So I felt that learning about culture was not enough. We needed a different kind of approach that was really based on how young children develop their identity and their attitudes. So what happened is that a group of us, teachers at Pacific Oaks College and Kay Taus at Seeds Elementary School at UCLA and Bill Sparks at Salvin School, decided to spend a couple of years really figuring out what we're calling an anti-bias approach would look like. The first thing we did was form a support group. We got together and we agreed that we would take a year to really seriously focus on the issue of anti-bias curriculum and to help each other learn how to do it. So we would meet together regularly, we would try out activities in the classroom, come back and really figure out what was going on. So the first step is really to form a support group. The second step was that we realized we needed to learn some things. First thing we needed to learn was much more about how children develop identity and attitudes. We did this in several ways. We read, we started to listen to the comments and questions that children made in the areas of gender and race, ethnicity, and disabilities, and we collected them and brought them back. We asked parents about what kinds of questions and comments they had heard their children make, so that we really opened our ears and our eyes to what children were thinking about in these areas. The other thing we had to do was to look at our own attitudes, how we felt about these areas of identity, and what attitudes of ours was interfering with us being able to address anti-bias issues with children. And that was the hard part. Learning about kids was interesting and fun. Looking at our own attitudes was really hard. It was painful. We cried sometimes.
You have to really start with yourself and see what your own values are, where your own level of comfort is. How comfortable do you feel talking about things? Are you willing to bring things up that don't come up? Are you willing to challenge the social prevailing attitudes that are really hindering our children from having their greater potential? And so anti-bias approach really starts with you as a teacher, and until you feel comfortable in that and in sharing with children, being honest with children, it'll be real hard to get children to be honest with others.
As we freed ourselves to look at our attitudes, to look at some of our own biases and discomforts, we were able to be much more creative about what to do with children. That the methods that we started to use are really based on good early childhood practice. What freed us to use those methods to address issues of gender and race and ethnicity and disability was our examining and freeing of our own attitudes. So the third step was evaluating our environment and looking at our books, at all our materials, at all of the posters on the wall, at what we had in the dramatic play area, what we had in the manipulative area, from the point of view of a couple of issues. One, whether we had any stereotypic material. We discovered that we did. The second was to make sure that we really had true diversity and not just tokenism.
I want to use the pictures, and I specifically want to use pictures that aren't real, that are from cards and stereotypes, images that people have of Native Americans, and also really use some real pictures of Native Americans so that children can pick up on the details and the differences in those two pictures. And they can learn to discriminate between what is actually real in the world and what are the images that we're given in the world. And if we show those pictures side by side, I think it's real interesting to see that children do pick up on how they're different. You know, they pick up on how
Let's put some hands up and take
Native Americans in the real pictures don't all wear feathers, that the Navajo women in the pictures, none of them had feathers on. They pick up on animals being dressed up like Indians or Native Americans and how real Native Americans don't do that. And they also pick up on how animals don't do those things.
Okay, Keisha, you go ahead. I think because not all Indians have feathers going up like this.
What do you think, Miles?
They're teasing Indians.
Think so? Okay. I want to show you some different kind of pictures. Try this one.
Dog or something.
Do you have any idea where these people might live?
India.
In India?
Yeah.
What do you think, Denise?
Native American.
They're Native Americans. That's true. What made you think that?
Then the fourth step, after we informed ourselves and evaluated the environment, was to really start acting, to put our ideas into practice. And our approach was we didn't want to add new activities to the curriculum. What we wanted to do was to take the anti-bias approach and integrate it into everything that we did, to integrate it into all the areas of the curriculum that already existed for the 2-year-olds, for the 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. We found at the beginning that we did a lot of very careful planning, but that once we started activities, other issues emerged from the children's responses. so that you have a kind of emergent quality to this approach once you start initiating specific activities. But what I think we realize is that you can make mistakes, and then you can go back into the classroom and change it. And you can say to the kids, I made a mistake, and we need to do some more work on this issue. And that's a very important part of figuring out how to do an anti-bias curriculum. The last step is to begin to develop a plan to involve parents, to inform parents about what we're doing, to begin to do some parent education about why an anti-bias approach is very important, then to involve them in figuring out how to make it work, to involve them in the classroom, to involve them in their understanding of how they can make an anti-bias approach in their own child rearing possible. And that, in a sense, starts the whole cycle again, because parents who are very interested can become part of the support group, and then you just keep going.
I'm going to stop there. And my initial thought was to break you up again, but it's 4:10, so not so much time to do that, but I'd love to hear what you're thinking. You're not thinking anything at all? Yeah, please.
I really like the part towards the end.
Can you speak up a little bit? Speak up.
Where they were talking about looking at the sort of stereotypical cartoonized images of a group and then looking at real pictures of them and being able to pick out the differences, because I feel like that's teaching them the tools they need to start finding those differences in the real world themselves, so that they don't have to always be told, well, that might not be correct, that might be a stereotype, but it was giving them the tools to be able to pick out those differences themselves.
Okay.
So I thought that was a really interesting part of that.
Did you hear that? Were you able to hear? Yeah, okay, thank you.
You know, the overlays of the maps had a, you know, it made me think that I should, you know, if you ask me, like take 8 Mile, and you said, you looked at the white part of town and the black part of town, and you said, is this town socioeconomically less? I would probably say yes. You know, is there more crime in this part of town? I'd probably say yes. I'd probably say that for the different parts of the black-white pictures. But it made me think, well, I should probably do some research on that. You know what I mean? I'm not saying it is or it's not, I don't know, but it just made me think, yeah, I definitely have this idea in my head.
There's this great Mark Twain quote where he says, it's not what you don't know that'll hurt you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. Right? So Michelle Alexander, who wrote a wonderful book called The New Jim Crow, right, about mass incarceration, tells a story about being on CNN, I think, right? She's recording a show, right? There's a host and a camera person, and they're recording a segment that'll play later. And so they're having a back and forth, and at some point she says, you know, they're talking about drugs and drug crimes and the number of people who are incarcerated for nonviolent drug crimes. And she said, you know, there's a real problem when you have so many more, a much greater share of Black and Latino people, especially young men, incarcerated for drug-related crimes, when in fact drug use among Black, white, Latino, et cetera, is the same, right? The best evidence we have suggests that these populations use illicit drugs at about the same rate, and that actually they're more white dealers, right? Drug dealing is actually more common among whites, young whites, than among young people of color. And he said, what? And she said, yes, no, you know. And she, you know, I mean, she was formerly at the ACLU of Northern California. I mean, she knows her stuff, right? And she's written this book about mass incarceration. I mean, she knows her stuff. And she said yes, and so she cites chapter and verse, and he told the camera person to shut off the camera, right? And because they really need, because he did not believe it. At the end, he did not believe it, and the segment never aired. Right? So he's talking to literally one of the foremost experts in the country on this stuff, and he is so certain right? It cannot be the case, right? This is the power of ideology, right? And the power of narratives, the narratives we tell, that, and again, it goes back to, imagine telling a child, suppose, that time when a child understands or learns that our prisons, our state and federal prisons, are disproportionately populated by black people and to a lesser degree Latino people. It's going to be very hard for that child to believe that it's not only because black and Latino people don't commit far more crimes than white people. Right? Because how could it be otherwise? Like, why would they be there? I'm reminded of another story of and someone who wrote this for our blog about his then 4-year-old daughter, biracial daughter, Asian American and white, who said to him, I wish there weren't any black people, right? He's like, right? He's an anti-racist guy, like he's flipping out. What do you mean that? It turns out she had heard that black people get arrested by police much more. And so her solution was for there not to be any black people, right? Because that was really upsetting to her. Again, right, like a child making a leap, and it's actually, that's not an unreasonable leap to make. It's like, oh, black people being arrested? No black people. That would solve the problem. Right? But then he has to explain, well, that's one possibility. Another possibility, right? Any more thoughts about anything you've seen here or about the road forward, possibly? Yep, please.
I like whenever they talk about how it's a marathon instead of a sprint, because I feel like we try to do that a lot in our center. Like not just with, like I know like if we have families in our room that want to celebrate like specific holidays, we like welcome them in, invite them in. But if we don't just do that, I feel like it's a lot. It's really dependent on the environment. So like the dolls and the toys you have, like the puzzles you have, the stories, everything like that. Like it's just a constant thing. I just feel like that was a good reminder. That is something that like we always need to be consciously working on.
There's so many conversations to be had, right? And you just think about, for any given child, how much that child changes, right? How much they become capable of, different kinds of conversations. Certainly if you're a parent of an adult child, right? That child has gone through a lot. The conversation you have at 5 is not the one you have at 10. Even if everything were to stay the same, which it doesn't, the environment also changes. Right? The national environment now around race is very different than it was when we were talking about, a post-racial America in 2008 because we had elected a black president. And there was someone over here. Oh, please.
Yeah, we had mentioned this earlier in the lunch, but for me, what stood out was the fact that when a child is interested in a caterpillar or what other topic, we are willing to do that. How about race? If a child asks that question and I don't have that information, why don't I investigate more? And so I thought that was important. When she said we can say, I don't know, let's find out together. For older kids, you can do, even for younger kids, you can do that as a topic and expose them more and give them more information.
Again, you heard, everyone? So let's acknowledge that caterpillars are unusually fascinating. All right? I mean, that's pretty interesting stuff. But I take you, I'm kidding. I get your point. And there was someone back here, right? Please.
I was basically about to say the exact same thing. We're very comfortable talking about science maybe with children or math. I'm very comfortable provoking children to talk about those subjects. But when children bring up race, I'm comfortable responding. But I want to look for the openings in conversation to provoke the discussion.
So who is uneasy when a kid brings it up? Who is uneasy responding to an explicitly racial conversation or race-related prompt from a kid? And who is uneasy sort of doing it proactively, right? Bringing it up when the kid hasn't? Nobody? Anybody? 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 Mostly not.
Because I think it's the fear of not knowing that we're going to say the right thing. That, you know, I want to make sure that I'm providing them what they need and what the response should be. And so I think it, you know, like Jen was saying, I think it's more education on our part to make sure that we know what to say and how to respond, you know, in those situations, I think.
And I think engaging our community, our center communities in that. You had brought up at the lunch of, you know, kind of creating philosophies and things surrounding that, so you can give that information to parents so they know what those expectations are and the conversations and provocations that we're going to set for children around this topic, instead of then dealing with, you know, the upset parent.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep, please.
Heather brought up parents, and that's what I was going to say. I don't feel uncomfortable or uneasy talking to a child about any of this because they're curious, they want to learn. Why wouldn't they question their world and everything around them? But there are times when I am worried that how I explain something might not be how the parent wants it to be explained. So I think it's also making sure that that communication is also open with your parents, and not even just like parents in your room, but just your whole center as a community, so that almost everyone is on the same level with that topic and understanding that topic, so parents know that a lot of times before the child even goes home, I'll say, when the parent comes in, I'll say, this is a question that was brought up to me today. Have you guys been talking about this at home? What have you been talking to them about? That way, at least, you do not upset the parent in what you're trying to communicate with the child. Because maybe that parent's not ready to have that conversation with the child, and if you start that conversation with the child before the parent is, then you're going to cause strife between you and the parent, and you don't want to mess that relationship up
Mm-hmm.
because you're not being open and communicative with the parent.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I feel like I'm more uneasy with knowing where that parent stands versus talking to your child.
Yep. Yep. Please.
Sometimes I think we overthink it. I mean, how many times has a kid said something to you, and you reflect back to them, and you said, tell me what you think about that. You know, rather than, you know, trying to explain it to them, have them explain it to you. You know, and that you know, for lack of a better, that'll buy you some time to sort of think about it, to talk to the parent about it. I mean, we're so used to reflecting everything with kids. Reflect that with them. Don't get tense and, you know, and worried about it. Ask their opinion. What do you think?
Andrew, to just jump in, one of the things that we've done with Andrew this morning is we had a parent session. We had about 22, I think I counted parents there. And a lot of them were very eager to also think about how they could do some of the same things that you've been grappling with this afternoon. And so I just wanted to mention that to say, one, there is, and of course it's spring break, so a lot of our parents aren't even here. So I think there is interest among parents. There's also a feeling among parents that they have no idea what they're doing. And so I think that they would see you as partners in helping them also think about this. And the third thing I'll just say with my parent hat on, there are a lot of things I never would have thought of bringing up with my older son had he not been starting to learn it in Butterfly Garden. And so I learn from you on a regular basis that my kid is capable of way more things than I think he is, even though as a parent, I of course think he's amazing. So I think it's really important that you see your professional roles as educators as maybe helping to push us when we might not even think that our kid is ready. That's a really important role that you play, and I would encourage you to own that role.
Yeah, you know, it's not always true, but just from today, and of course I can't say that I have, you know, a full sense of how parents and you all and parents interact, but that is, my guess is, I mean, it's an amazing, this in itself, I know you're not all from, what's the name of the other one? Bennett. Are an amazing facility. Jen, I'm already a big admirer of Jen right here. Here's Jen, people. I think there is tremendous, I think, my guess is that you have significant social capital with your parents, right? And if you have that, you know, so the race conversation or any particular difficult conversation around which people are inclined to have very, you know, a range of opinions isn't necessarily where you want to start the relationship, right? But once it's established, right, once you know you have that trust, I think that can take you far, right? So yes, open communication, giving a heads up, being, right, I mean, you know what, probably the thing in my experience that upsets parents most is when they don't hear about something, right? Especially something chronic. Oh, it's been happening, you know, it's been happening for 6 months now, and they're only hearing about it, right? Lines of communication stay open. And I tell you, I mean, I don't know, I mean, as a parent, and obviously this is work I'm doing, you know, my wife and I are pretty involved, you know, trying to track what's happening with our kids and all of that. And I know, right, when I was telling Jen, I mean, when we had a teacher who was amazing, right, 30 years in and just, right, telling us all sorts of things which ran perfectly true about our children that we didn't know, that I'll go pretty far, right? I'm going to give her a lot of leeway because I know that she's much better than I am at many things that are for the benefit of my kid. And I suspect that many of you are in that same situation with respect to many of your parents. Any last word from anybody? Anybody? Well, thank you, and I wish you good luck.
Thank you.